The most dangerous warrior in ancient Japan once defeated his greatest enemy wearing a dress. No army, no armor, no battle cry. Just a robe, a concealed sword, and a level of cold nerve that most soldiers couldn't dream of. His name was Yamato Takeru, and if you've never heard it before, that's about to change. Imagine the most feared warrior in all of ancient Japan. A man so dangerous, his own father was terrified of him. A prince who had already left a trail of defeated enemies across the length of the country. Now imagine that same man, on the night of his most crucial mission, doing something nobody could have predicted. He's not sharpening his sword. He's not leading a charge. He's letting down his hair, slipping into a woman's robe, and walking straight into his enemy's banquet. Alone, unarmed to all appearances, moving through a room full of warriors as though he belongs there. And here's the wildest part. It worked. Flawlessly. Fatally. That man was Yamato Takeru. And that moment, as strange and unexpected as it sounds, is just the beginning of one of the most remarkable stories ancient Japan ever produced. There's a man whose name has echoed through Japanese history for nearly 2,000 years, and most people in the Western world have never heard of him. His story involves battles, betrayal, a magic sword, and a death so poetic it almost doesn't feel real. But here's the thing, that's exactly what makes it so fascinating. Yamato Takeru wasn't just a warrior. He was a symbol, one of the most powerful symbols an ancient civilization ever produced. And once you understand who he was, you'll never look at Japanese culture the same way again. Now, before we go any further, let's get one thing straight. Was Yamato Takeru a real person? Historians have been wrestling with that question for centuries, and the honest answer is, it's complicated. The ancient chronicles place his birth around 72 AD and his death around 114 AD, which would make him a prince of early Japan. But the line between the man and the myth got blurred so long ago that separating them feels almost beside the point. What we do know is that his story was taken seriously enough to be written into Japan's oldest books, and that tells us something important right there. Here's a perspective that might blow your mind. Yamato Takeru is probably best understood not as a single individual, but as a kind of composite hero, a legendary figure built from the real deeds of multiple military commanders who were sent across Japan to bring rebellious peoples under the rule of the Yamato court. Think of it like this. Imagine if every great general in American history, Washington, Grant, Patton, got merged into one mythic soldier. That's essentially what happened here. The people needed a hero big enough to represent their entire world, so they built one. What makes this even more interesting is where his story comes from. The two main sources, the Kojiki, compiled in 712 AD, and the Nihon Shoki, written just 8 years later, are Japan's oldest surviving chronicles. These weren't casual records. They were carefully constructed national narratives, written to establish the legitimacy of the imperial line and explain the spiritual origins of the Japanese people. When Yamato Takeru shows up in both of these monumental texts, it means his story wasn't just entertainment. It was official. It mattered. And here's what's really worth sitting with. Whether Yamato Takeru was one man, many men, or something in between, his story survived. Temples were built in his honor. Festivals are still held every year in his name. His image appears in video games, manga, and anime. Something about this ancient prince refuses to stay in the past. So the real question isn't whether he existed. It's why his story still matters. And to answer that, we have to start at the very beginning of the legend, with a moment so dark and shocking, it sets the tone for everything that follows. It's the early 700s AD in Japan. The imperial court is consolidating power, unifying a nation, and doing what every great civilization eventually does. It sits down and writes its own story. Not just any story, though, a foundational story. The kind that explains where the people came from, why their rulers have the right to rule, and what kind of heroes walk among them. That's the world that gave birth to the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, and without these two texts, Yamato Takeru would have been lost to time forever. The Kojiki, compiled in 712 AD, holds the title of Japan's oldest surviving chronicle. Its name literally translates to Record of Ancient Matters, and it reads exactly like that. A sweeping, dramatic account that begins with the creation of the universe and works its way down through the gods, the first emperors, and eventually to figures like Yamato Takeru. What's fascinating is that the Kojiki wasn't written to entertain. It was dictated, out loud, by a man named Hieda no Are, who had memorized centuries of oral tradition, and then transcribed by a court scholar named O no Yasumaro. Think about that for a second. This wasn't a document born in silence. It was a living memory, finally given a permanent home. Just 8 years later, in 720 AD, the Nihon Shoki arrived, and things got interesting. The Nihon Shoki, or Chronicles of Japan, covered much of the same ground as the Kojiki, but with a noticeably different tone. Where the Kojiki leaned into the raw, almost primal energy of the old oral tradition, the Nihon Shoki was more polished, more formal, written in classical Chinese, the prestige language of the era, clearly designed to impress not just the Japanese court, but foreign eyes as well. Same hero, different lens. And when you place the two versions of Yamato Takeru's story side by side, the differences are revealing. In the Kojiki, the relationship between the prince and his father, Emperor Keiko, is tense, painful, almost adversarial. In the Nihon Shoki, they actually get along. Two books, two very different emotional realities. So which version do historians trust more? Most scholars lean toward the Kojiki as the older, more faithful reflection of the original legend, closer to the raw, unfiltered tradition that was passed down through generations before anyone wrote a single word of it. The Nihon Shoki, for all its sophistication, carries the fingerprints of political editing. But here's the beautiful irony. Both texts are necessary. Together, they give us a fuller, richer picture of the man, or the myth, than either one could deliver alone. It's like getting two eyewitness accounts of the same incredible event. They don't always agree, but that tension between them is where the truth hides. Here's why all of this matters to you right now, as someone about to hear this story. The fact that Yamato Takeru's legend was preserved in not one, but two of the most important documents in Japanese history means his story carried serious weight. These weren't casual mentions. These were deliberate inclusions in texts that shaped an entire nation's identity. So when the chronicles describe his life, his victories, his grief, his flaws, his death, they're not just telling a hero's tale. They're making a statement about what it means to be human. And the very first statement that story makes is one that's guaranteed to grab your attention. Every great legend has a moment that grabs you by the collar and refuses to let go. For Yamato Takeru, that moment comes right at the start, and it's not a glorious battle or a divine prophecy. It's a murder, a brutal, cold-blooded, deeply unsettling act that happens before the hero has even had a chance to become one. And the reason this opening matters so much isn't just because of the shock value. It's because it tells you everything about the kind of man Yamato Takeru was, raw, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore. Here's what went down. Emperor Keiko, the 12th emperor of Japan and Yamato Takeru's father, noticed that his elder twin son had stopped showing up for meals at the imperial table. In ancient Japanese court culture, sharing meals with the emperor wasn't just dinner, it was a formal act of loyalty and submission. So the emperor summoned the young prince, then still known as Usu, and asked him to go reprimand his brother and bring him back in line. Simple enough request, right? What happened next was anything but simple. When the emperor asked why the brother still hadn't appeared after 5 days, Usu calmly explained that he had already instructed him. By ambushing him in the lavatory, smashing him to pieces, tearing off his limbs, wrapping the remains in a straw mat, and throwing them away. Let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't a battlefield killing. This wasn't even a duel. This was something closer to a quiet, calculated act of violence carried out in the most mundane setting imaginable, and delivered to his father as though it were the most normal thing in the world. The ancient text records the emperor's reaction not as grief or rage, but as fear. Emperor Keiko was genuinely terrified of his own son. And honestly, that reaction makes complete sense. There's something uniquely chilling about a person who commits an act of extreme violence without hesitation, without remorse, and without any apparent awareness that it might be considered excessive. But here's where it gets psychologically interesting. The chronicles don't frame this moment as pure villainy. They present it as the first glimpse of something that will define Yamato Takeru's entire life, an almost supernatural intensity that makes him extraordinary and dangerous in equal measure. He didn't misunderstand the assignment. He understood it too well, in his own uncompromising way. His father said, "Deal with your brother." Usu dealt with his brother. The problem wasn't his loyalty to the imperial command. The problem was that his inner fire burned at a temperature no one around him could handle, not even his own father. That tension between greatness and danger is the heartbeat of this entire legend. What's worth remembering here is that this violent opening isn't a bug in the story, it's a feature. The ancient storytellers weren't trying to present a perfect hero. They were building something far more interesting. A hero who is real in the most uncomfortable sense of the word. Flawed, fierce, and fueled by forces even he can't fully control. And that's precisely what makes the next chapter of his story so loaded with meaning. Because Emperor Keiko, now deeply unsettled by what his son was capable of, had to make a decision. And the decision he made would set Yamato Takeru on a path that would define the rest of his short, extraordinary life. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being misunderstood by the one person whose approval matters most. Most men have felt some version of it, that quiet, gnawing ache of doing everything you're capable of, only to find that your best isn't what was wanted. For Yamato Takeru, that feeling wasn't a passing phase, it was the defining wound of his entire life, and it started with a father who looked at his own son and saw not a hero, but a threat. Emperor Keiko didn't punish Yamato Takeru for killing his brother. He did something far colder. He sent him away. The move was deliberate, calculated, and wrapped in the language of duty. On the surface, it looked like an honor. The emperor was trusting his son with a critical military mission, dispatching him to the southwestern region of Kumaso, in what is now Kumamoto Prefecture, to subdue a rebellious tribe that refused to bow to the imperial court. But read between the lines, and the message becomes painfully clear. Keiko wasn't sending his son on a mission because he believed in him. He was sending him because he was afraid of him. And putting distance between them felt safer than keeping that kind of uncontrollable force close to the throne. It's a move as old as power itself. When you can't control someone, you redirect them. What makes this moment so human and so heartbreaking is that Yamato Takeru almost certainly understood exactly what was happening. He wasn't naive. The chronicles show us a young man of extraordinary perception, someone who read situations with a clarity that went far beyond his years. He knew his father feared him. He knew this mission wasn't a reward. And yet, and this is the part that separates him from an ordinary warrior, he went anyway. Not because he had no choice, but because somewhere beneath all that ferocity was a son who still desperately wanted to prove himself worthy of his father's love. That's not weakness. That's one of the most relatable things about him. Here's something worth thinking about. Emperor Keiko's fear wasn't entirely irrational. A son who could kill his own twin brother without blinking, wrap the pieces in a mat, and calmly report back to the emperor. That's not a person you keep close without some serious anxiety. But fear, when it drives a parent's decisions, has a way of creating exactly the kind of tragedy it's trying to avoid. By pushing Yamato Takeru away rather than channeling him, Keiko didn't neutralize his son's intensity. He weaponized it, pointed it outward at the world, where it would grow into something even more formidable. And then, when the mission was done and the prince came home victorious, Keiko would do it again and again. That pattern, send him away, watch him succeed, send him away again, is the engine that drives Yamato Takeru's entire story forward. It's also what transforms him, slowly and inevitably, from a fearless young warrior into something more complex. a man fighting battles on the outside while carrying an invisible war on the inside. And the first of those external battles was one for the ages. Because the Kumaso weren't just any enemy. They were fierce, proud, and deeply entrenched in their own land. Taking them down would require not just strength, but a kind of cunning that nobody, least of all Emperor Keiko, could have predicted from his terrifying young son. If someone told you that one of the greatest warriors in Japanese history defeated his most dangerous enemy by disguising himself as a woman and sneaking into a party, you'd probably think they were joking. But that's exactly what happened. And the more you think about it, the more brilliant it becomes. Because what Yamato Takeru did in the land of the Kumaso wasn't just a clever trick. It was a masterclass in strategic thinking, emotional intelligence, and the kind of fearless adaptability that separates truly great warriors from merely strong ones. Brute force gets you so far. Wit gets you the rest of the way. Here's how it played out. The Kumaso were a powerful, defiant tribe in southwestern Japan who had flatly refused to submit to the Yamato imperial court. Their leader, a formidable man known as Torishi Kaya, or the Brave of Kahakami, was hosting a grand banquet for his relatives and allies. Getting close enough to kill him through direct confrontation would have been nearly impossible. The camp was well guarded, the men were battle-hardened, and a lone young prince walking in through the front door with a sword would have lasted about 30 seconds. So Yamato Takeru didn't walk in through the front door. Before leaving for the mission, his aunt Yamato Haim had given him her own upper garment and skirt, and the prince used them in a way nobody could have anticipated. Dressed in his aunt's clothing, hair let down, moving with the grace of a young woman, Yamato Takeru slipped into the banquet undetected. And here's the detail that makes this story so richly human. It worked not just because of the disguise, but because of him. The chronicles note that Torishi Kaya was immediately enchanted by the apparently beautiful young woman who had appeared at his feast, and personally invited her to sit beside him. Think about what that required from Yamato Takeru, a man described elsewhere as possessing extraordinary physical presence and warrior's bearing. To pull off that performance, he had to completely set aside everything that made him dangerous and inhabit something entirely different. That's not weakness. That level of control is its own kind of power. As the night wore on and Torishi Kaya grew drunk and his guests thinned out, the moment arrived. This timing wasn't accidental. Yamato Takeru had been watching, waiting, and calculating the entire evening. By the time he moved, the room had largely emptied. The guard's attention was at its lowest, and he still had a sword concealed against his body beneath those robes the whole time. He was never truly unarmed, not for a single second. He drew the blade and struck with the cold precision of someone who had been waiting patiently for exactly the right moment. The Kumaso leader was mortally wounded, but not yet dead. And what happened in those final moments is one of the most remarkable exchanges in all of ancient Japanese literature. Now here's the question the ancient chronicles never bother to answer, and the silence is almost more fascinating than any explanation could be. How exactly did Yamato Takeru walk out of that enemy camp, alone, in hostile territory, wearing a dead man's enemy's robes? The texts don't say. What we know is that the room had emptied, the guards were off their guard, and the people still present weren't facing a recognizable warrior. They were facing what appeared to be a young woman who had just produced a sword from beneath her robes and moved with lethal speed. That shock, that split second of pure disbelief, was probably all he needed. And here's what's worth sitting with. Infiltration over confrontation, disguise over armor, patience and timing over brute aggression. Those aren't the tactics of a conventional ancient warrior. They are, however, the exact principles that the world would one day call ninjutsu. Yamato Takeru didn't found the ninja tradition. That wouldn't emerge for another 1,000 years. But on the night he walked into that banquet and walked back out again, he became its spiritual blueprint. And somehow, that silence in the historical record makes the whole thing even more unsettling. Because it means that when he finally stood before his dying enemy and revealed who he was, the weight of that moment hit like thunder. There's something profound about the moment a person receives the name they'll carry through history. Not the name they were born with, but the name they earned. The one that captures who they truly are, stripped of family titles and court formalities, distilled into something pure and undeniable. For this prince, that moment came not in a throne room, not in a victory parade, and not from the lips of his father. It came from a dying enemy on the floor of a banquet hall, and it hit like a thunderclap. From that moment forward, Usu was gone. Yamato Takeru had arrived. The name itself carries enormous weight. Yamato referred to the heartland of ancient Japan, the imperial homeland, the cultural and spiritual center of the emerging nation. To be called the brave of Yamato wasn't just a compliment. It was a declaration. It meant that this young prince didn't just represent himself or his father's ambitions. He embodied the spirit of an entire civilization. And the fact that this declaration came from a man who had spent his life defying that civilization makes it all the more powerful. Torishi Kaya, the Kumaso leader, had resisted the Yamato court until his dying breath. But he recognized greatness when it stood over him with a sword. That kind of acknowledgement, from that kind of source, means everything. Here's something worth sitting with. Names have always mattered deeply in Japanese culture, and never more so than in the ancient world recorded in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki. In that worldview, a name wasn't just a label, it was a spiritual reality. To receive a name was to have your essence recognized and formalized. When Torishi Kaya named the prince Yamato Takeru, he wasn't just paying a compliment. He was, in a very real sense, completing something. He was acknowledging that the young man standing before him had already become what the name described, before anyone else had the wisdom or the courage to say it out loud. In that light, the dying enemy wasn't a defeated foe. He was a witness. What's fascinating is how this moment reframes everything that came before it. The brutal killing of his brother, the fear in his father's eyes, the dangerous intensity that made everyone around him uncomfortable. Suddenly, all of that looks different. What Emperor Keiko saw as a threat, the Kumaso leader recognized as extraordinary power. What the imperial court treated as something to be managed and redirected, a proud warrior on his deathbed honored as something rare. Yamato Takeru didn't change between the privy and the banquet hall. The world's understanding of him did. And that shift, from feared anomaly to recognized hero, is one of the most quietly revolutionary moments in the entire legend. But here's the thing about receiving a great name. It doesn't make life easier. If anything, it raises the stakes. Because now the prince wasn't just a dangerous son being kept at a safe distance by a wary emperor. He was Yamato Takeru, the brave of Yamato, and the weight of that identity would follow him everywhere he went from that moment forward. His next stop after the Kumaso lands would prove that point immediately. Because the prince wasn't finished. There was another enemy waiting, one that would require a completely different kind of cunning, and the legend was just getting started. If the Kumaso mission showed the world that Yamato Takeru could be patient, adaptive, and dangerously clever, then what happened next in the province of Izumo confirmed something even more unsettling. This was a man who could befriend you, earn your trust, make you feel genuinely seen and valued, and then use every single bit of that connection against you. It's the kind of move that makes historians uncomfortable and storytellers absolutely electric with excitement. Because the Izumo deception wasn't just a military tactic. It was a psychological masterpiece, and it reveals a dimension of Yamato Takeru that brute force alone never could. Izumo was a province of enormous spiritual significance in ancient Japan, home to powerful local traditions, proud warrior culture, and a ruler who had no intention of bowing to the Yamato court. His name was Izumo Takeru, and unlike the Kumaso leader who could be caught off guard at a drunken banquet, this man was sharp, experienced, and surrounded by loyalists. A direct confrontation would have been costly at best, suicidal at worst. So Yamato Takeru did something that, on the surface, looked like the complete opposite of aggression. He made friends with him. Genuinely, warmly, convincingly, he became the kind of companion that Izumo Takeru had no reason to distrust. Here's where the genius and the cold ruthlessness of the plan comes into full focus. During the period of their friendship, Yamato Takeru quietly carved a replica sword out of wood and at just the right moment suggested they swap blades as a gesture of camaraderie and mutual respect. Izumo Takeru agreed, accepting what he believed was the prince's real sword and handing over his own. It was the kind of symbolic exchange warriors made, a bond sealed in steel. Except one of those swords wasn't steel at all. It was wood. And when the two men eventually faced each other in a duel, Izumo Takeru reached for his blade and found something that couldn't cut through air, let alone an opponent. The outcome was swift and absolute. Now it would be easy to look at this episode and feel a flicker of unease, and that's actually the point. The ancient storytellers weren't trying to present Yamato Takeru as a spotless, honorable hero in the Western mold. They were presenting something far more nuanced, a warrior who understood that the world doesn't always reward the most noble approach, and who was willing to do whatever the mission required. In Izumo, the mission required deception. In Kumaso, it required disguise. In both cases, the prince read his environment, identified the most effective path forward, and executed it without hesitation. That's not dishonesty for its own sake. That's strategic intelligence operating at an elite level. But here's what the chronicles leave hanging in the air after the Izumo chapter closes. Yamato Takeru returned home to Yamato triumphant. 2 missions accomplished. 2 powerful enemies defeated. By any reasonable measure, this was the moment his father should have welcomed him back with open arms, acknowledged his extraordinary capabilities, and finally, given him the recognition he had earned. What actually happened when he arrived home was something very different. And the gap between what Yamato Takeru deserved in that moment and what he actually received is where this story takes its most emotionally powerful turn yet. There are moments in a person's life when the weight of everything they've been carrying finally becomes too heavy to hide, when the armor cracks, just slightly, and the human being underneath becomes visible. For Yamato Takeru, a man who had killed without hesitation, infiltrated enemy camps in disguise, and defeated warrior after warrior across the length of Japan, that moment came not on a battlefield, but at a shrine. Standing before his aunt, Yamato Hime, the highest priestess of Amaterasu at the sacred grand shrine of Ise, the great hero did something that no enemy had ever made him do. He broke down. And in that vulnerability, the legend becomes something far more than an action story. Here's what had happened. Yamato Takeru returned home from his victories in Kumaso and Izumo expecting, perhaps not a celebration, but at least a moment of rest. A pause. Some acknowledgement from his father that the missions were complete, and the prince had earned a breath. Instead, Emperor Keiko barely let him settle before issuing new orders. Go east, subdue the rebel tribes and savage deities of the eastern lands, and don't come back until it's done. No rest, no recognition, no warmth. Just another mission, another dangerous frontier, another quiet message from a father who still couldn't bring himself to keep his extraordinary son close. So on his way east, Yamato Takeru stopped at Ise, and what he said there is one of the most raw human moments in all of ancient Japanese literature. He looked at his aunt and said simply, "Does my father wish that I would die?" 5 words. No battle cry, no warrior's bravado, no carefully constructed court language. Just a son, exhausted and aching, asking out loud the question he had probably been carrying since the very first time he was sent away. Yamato Hime, to her eternal credit, didn't deflect or offer empty reassurance. She responded with compassion, the kind of deep, quiet compassion that only someone who truly sees another person can offer. And then she gave him 2 gifts that would define the next chapter of his life. A sacred sword called Ame no Murakumo no Tsurugi, the sword of the gathering clouds of heaven, and a small bag she told him to open only in a moment of extreme danger. The sword itself carries a mythology that deserves a moment of attention. This wasn't just any weapon. It was the blade that the storm god Susanoo had pulled from the body of Yamata no Orochi, the the terrifying eight-headed serpent of Japanese legend, after defeating it in one of the great mythological battles of the Kojiki. Susanoo had offered the sword to the sun goddess Amaterasu, who passed it down through the divine lineage until it eventually came to rest at Ise. For Yamato Hime to give this sword to her nephew wasn't just a practical gift. It was a spiritual endorsement of the highest possible order, a declaration that this prince carried divine backing on his journey east. The sword didn't just cut through enemies, it connected the hero to the gods themselves. What this scene does, quietly, brilliantly, is reframe the entire emotional landscape of the legend. Up until this point, Yamato Takeru has been defined largely by action, what he did, how he fought, who he defeated. But here at Ise, we see what drives all of that action. Beneath the fearless warrior is a man who deeply needs to be seen, valued, and loved, and who has been denied that by the one person whose approval he craves most. His aunt gives him something his father never has: unconditional care. And that gift, it turns out, is just as powerful as any magic sword. Because the Eastern campaign that lies ahead of him is going to test not just his strength, but every single thing he's made of. There's a particular kind of danger that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come at you with weapons drawn or war cries echoing across a battlefield. It comes disguised as an opportunity, a friendly tip, a generous invitation, a stroke of good luck that turns out to be anything but. And in the eastern lands of Japan, Yamato Takeru walked straight into exactly that kind of trap. What happened next would produce one of the most iconic moments in all of Japanese mythology. A moment so dramatic, so perfectly constructed, that it has been retold for nearly 2,000 years and still hasn't lost a single volt of its electric charge. Here's the setup. As Yamato Takeru made his way through the eastern provinces, a local lord, treacherous, calculating, and deeply unwilling to submit to imperial authority, fed the prince a tip that seemed almost too good to be true. In a nearby moor, he was told, there were large deer worth hunting, the kind of game that a warrior of Yamato Takeru's stature would surely want to pursue. The prince, perhaps riding the confidence of his recent victories, took the bait. He rode out into the open grassland, and the moment he was deep enough into the moor, surrounded by dry grass stretching in every direction, the trap was sprung. The Lord set the field on fire. Flames erupted on all sides, moving fast, fed by wind and the bone-dry vegetation of the moor. Yamato Takeru found himself encircled by an inferno with no obvious way out. This is the moment where the sword his aunt gave him revealed its true nature, and it happened in a way that still gives scholars and storytellers chills. Yamato Takeru drew Ame no Murakumo no Tsurugi and began cutting back the grass around him, desperately trying to remove fuel from the fire closing in on all sides. And then something extraordinary happened. As he swung the blade, he discovered that the sword didn't just cut grass, it controlled wind. Every swing directed the air itself, bending the flow of the fire like a conductor leading an orchestra. In that single breathtaking moment, a man fighting for his life became something else entirely, a force of nature wielding a weapon that answered to his will. He remembered the bag his aunt had told him to open only in a moment of great peril, and this certainly qualified. Inside were fire strikers. Using the sword to command the wind and the fire strikers to ignite a counterblaze, Yamato Takeru turned the trap completely inside out. The fire that was meant to consume him became a weapon in his hands, sweeping back toward the treacherous lord and his men with devastating force. When the smoke cleared, his enemies were gone, and Yamato Takeru was standing in a burned field, alive, victorious, and holding a sword that had just revealed itself to be something far beyond a weapon. In triumph, he renamed it Kusanagi no Tsurugi, the grass-cutting sword, a name that would echo through Japanese history for millennia. And here's what makes this episode so much more than a great action sequence. Kusanagi went on to become one of the 3 imperial treasures of Japan, sacred objects that are, to this day, considered symbols of the legitimacy of the Japanese imperial throne. The sword that saved Yamato Takeru's life in a burning field is still venerated at Atsuta Shrine in Nagoya, where it has been kept for centuries, seen by almost no one, wrapped in layers of sacred protocol that underscore just how seriously this legend is still taken. But as powerful as that moment of survival and triumph was, the Eastern campaign was far from over. And the next challenge Yamato Takeru faced would cost him something that no sword, however miraculous, could protect him from losing. Every great hero's story has a moment that shifts the emotional center of gravity. A moment where the stakes stop being about victory or defeat and become about something far more personal, far more tender, and far more devastating. For Yamato Takeru, that moment came not on land, where he had proven himself invincible, but at sea, in the middle of a storm that no sword could cut through and no strategy could outmaneuver. And at the heart of that storm was a woman whose name deserves to be remembered just as fiercely as his own. Ototachibana Hime, his wife, who did something in that moment that redefines what courage actually looks like. Here's the scene. Yamato Takeru and his party were crossing the waters of Hashiri no Mizu, part of what is now Tokyo Bay, on their way to confront the Amishi tribes of the Far East. Without warning, a violent storm erupted. The sea turned savage, the waves rose to terrifying heights, and the ship was thrown into chaos, unable to move forward or retreat. In the ancient Japanese worldview, a storm like this wasn't random weather. It was the fury of the sea god, a divine force expressing displeasure, demanding acknowledgement, requiring appeasement. And appeasement, in the brutal spiritual calculus of that era, meant sacrifice. Someone had to give themselves to the sea to calm its rage. Someone had to step forward voluntarily and offer their life so that everyone else could live. Ototachibana Hime stepped forward. She told her husband, the most fearsome warrior in all of Japan, a man who had defeated enemies across the length of the country, that she would go into the sea in his place. She gathered woven sedge mats, animal skins, and silk rugs, laid them on the water's surface, stepped onto them, and descended into the waves. The storm, according to the chronicles, died immediately. The sea god was satisfied, the ship was free, and Yamato Takeru, standing on the deck watching his wife disappear beneath the water, found himself facing something he had never encountered in any battle. A loss he was completely powerless to prevent. No sword, no strategy, no cunning disguise could bring her back. What makes Ototachibana Hime's sacrifice so extraordinary isn't just the act itself, it's what it reveals about the nature of true devotion. She didn't sacrifice herself out of desperation or because she had no other choice. She did it deliberately, willingly, with full understanding of what it meant. In a story full of warriors and weapons and divine interventions, her quiet act of courage stands apart as something almost unbearably human. 7 days after her death, her comb washed ashore, and Yamato Takeru, this man who had never shown grief or vulnerability to any enemy, built her a tomb around it. The great hero stopped. He built. He remembered. That detail, small as it seems, is one of the most emotionally powerful moments in the entire legend. The chronicles record that as Yamato Takeru continued his journey east after crossing the bay, he climbed a mountain pass and looked back toward the direction from which he had come. Back toward Yamato, back toward home, back toward everything he had left behind and everyone he had lost. And he wept. He cried out, "Ah, my wife," a lament so simple and so raw that it became legendary in its own right, eventually lending its name to an entire region of Japan. This is the moment where the warrior myth cracks open completely and something truer spills out. Because grief has a way of doing that, of reaching past every title, every victory, every carefully constructed identity, and finding the man underneath. And the man underneath Yamato Takeru, it turns out, was capable of a depth of feeling that matched every ounce of his legendary strength. There's something almost paradoxical about what happened after Ototachibana Hime's death. A lesser man, or a man driven purely by glory and conquest, might have crumbled under that kind of grief, or let the rage of loss turn him into something reckless and destructive. But Yamato Takeru did something that speaks volumes about the kind of warrior he truly was. He kept going. Not because he had stopped feeling, not because the grief had faded, but because the mission still existed, the eastern lands still waited, and the prince who had been forged in fire, deception, and sacrifice was not the kind of man who stopped moving forward. What happened in the east would prove, once and for all, that his reputation had traveled far ahead of him. The Emishi were no small challenge. They were the people of the far northeastern reaches of Honshu, fierce, independent, deeply rooted in their own traditions, and stubbornly resistant to the expansion of Yamato imperial authority. For generations, they had held their ground against the court's attempts to bring them into the fold, and they had every intention of continuing to do so. When word reached them that Yamato Takeru was coming, this prince who had already cut through the Kumaso in the southwest and the Izumo ruler in the west, they gathered their forces on the beach, ready to meet him with everything they had. It must have been an imposing sight. Warriors lined up along the shore, weapons ready, braced for a confrontation with the imperial court's most dangerous instrument. Then something unexpected happened. As Yamato Takeru's ship came into clear view, moving steadily across the water toward the shore, the Emishi chieftains looked at what was approaching, and something shifted. The chronicles describe it simply but powerfully. They realized that resistance was futile. They threw down their weapons. They submitted. Without a single blow exchanged on that beach, the Eastern Campaign's most significant military objective was achieved, not through bloodshed, but through the sheer, overwhelming force of a reputation so formidable that it functioned as its own weapon. In military history, there's a term for this kind of victory: deterrence, and Yamato Takeru had achieved it at the highest possible level. Now it would be tempting to read this moment purely as a military triumph, and it absolutely was that. But there's a deeper layer worth examining. Think about what it took to build that kind of reputation. Every disguise, every deception, every battle, every sacrifice, all of it had accumulated into something that preceded him like a shadow across the landscape. The Emishi chieftains weren't surrendering to a man. They were surrendering to a story, one so consistently, relentlessly powerful, that continuing to fight against it seemed not just dangerous, but genuinely pointless. That's a kind of influence that goes beyond physical strength. It's the influence of a life lived so fully and so ferociously that it reshapes the world around it. But here's what the Eastern triumph couldn't give Yamato Takeru, and what the chronicles make painfully clear in the chapters that follow. Victory in battle couldn't fill the spaces that had been hollowed out by grief and his father's persistent distance. The Emishi were subdued. The eastern lands were brought under imperial authority. By any objective measure, the mission was a stunning success. And yet, as Yamato Takeru turned his face westward and began the long journey home to Yamato, something had shifted in him, something quieter and more dangerous than any enemy he had faced so far. Because the greatest battle of his life wasn't waiting for him in the east. It was waiting on a mountain. There's a concept that the ancient Greeks called hubris, the kind of overconfidence that comes from too many victories, too much power, too long a stretch of time where everything you touch turns to triumph. It's the moment a great person starts to believe that the rules which apply to everyone else somehow don't apply to them. The ancient Japanese storytellers understood this concept just as deeply as the Greeks did, even if they never used that word, and they built it into the legend of Yamato Takeru with surgical precision. Because the moment that brings the great hero down isn't a superior enemy, or a larger army, or an unbeatable weapon, it's a decision. One single, quietly catastrophic decision made on the way home. After the stunning success of the Eastern Campaign, Yamato Takeru was riding a wave of momentum and confidence that was, by any measure, entirely justified. He had subdued the Kumaso, outwitted the Izumo ruler, survived a burning field with a divine sword, crossed treacherous waters after the most heartbreaking loss of his life, and brought the fierce emishi to their knees without even drawing a blade. He was on his way home, finally, to Yamato. And there was one more challenge waiting along the route. The god of Mount Ibuki, a deity of formidable power residing on the mountain that sits on the border between what are now Shiga and Gifu prefectures. Any other day, Yamato Takeru would have approached this confrontation with every tool at his disposal. But not this day. Before setting out to challenge the god of Mount Ibuki, the prince did something he had never done before. Something so out of character that the ancient texts almost seemed to pause and hold their breath around it. He left Kusanagi behind. The sacred sword, the grass-cutting sword, the blade that had saved his life in the burning moor and connected him to the divine lineage of Amaterasu and Susanoo, he left it at the home of his fiancée Miyazuhime in Owari, as though he simply didn't feel he needed it anymore. The chronicles offer a glimpse into his thinking. He seems to have believed that this particular confrontation didn't warrant the sword, that he was enough on his own, that bare hands and sheer will would suffice against a mountain god. Here's where the story delivers its most sobering lesson, and it does so without drama or fanfare, which somehow makes it even more powerful. The god of Mount Ibuki appeared not in a terrifying divine form, but in the shape of a white boar. Yamato Takeru, perhaps still riding the high of the emishi's bloodless surrender, dismissed what he saw, reportedly declaring that this creature was merely a messenger of the god, not the god itself, and that he would deal with the actual deity on his way back down the mountain. He walked past. He didn't fight. He didn't use the reverence and caution that a divine confrontation demands. And the god, taking the shape of a great white boar, responded by unleashing an icy, supernatural rain that soaked the prince to his core and planted in him the seeds of a curse that no medicine and no warrior's will could overcome. By the time Yamato Takeru descended from Mount Ibuki, something was wrong. Deeply, irreversibly wrong. The strength that had defined him his entire life was draining away, replaced by a weakness that spread through him like frost through stone. He had faced gods before and won. He had survived fire, storm, and betrayal. But this time, he had walked into a divine confrontation without his sacred weapon, without the humility that such an encounter required, and without the caution that a lifetime of remarkable victories had perhaps slowly, quietly eroded. The mountain god hadn't defeated him with power. It had defeated him with the one thing no sword can cut through, the consequence of his own certainty. And now, for the first time in his extraordinary life, Yamato Takeru was not winning. There's a particular kind of tragedy that hits differently than all the others. Not the tragedy of defeat in battle, or betrayal by an enemy, or the cruelty of fate striking without warning. Those are painful, but they carry a certain clean finality. The tragedy that truly lingers, the kind that stays with you long after the story is over, is the tragedy of a great person diminished slowly, piece by piece, far from everything they love, with full awareness of what is happening to them. That's the tragedy of Yamato Takeru's death, and the ancient storytellers rendered it with a tenderness and precision that makes it, even 2,000 years later, almost unbearable to read. After descending from Mount Ibuki, the prince pressed on, because that's what he did. Stopping wasn't in his nature even now, but the curse the mountain god had laid upon him was relentless, and the body that had once seemed capable of anything was failing with every step. He made his way to a spring called Samagai in what is now Shiga Prefecture, hoping the cool, clear water might restore some of his fading strength. It didn't. He pressed on to Nobo in what is now Kamiyama City in Mie Prefecture. And there, on an open moor, his legs finally gave out beneath him. What makes this moment so achingly human is what he chose to do with his remaining strength. He composed a poem. In Japanese literary tradition, the act of composing verse at the moment of death, a jisei or death poem, was considered one of the most profound expressions of a person's inner life. With his body failing and the distance between himself and home stretching out like an insurmountable ocean, Yamato Takeru turned his face toward Yamato and spoke of longing for the land, for the people, for the life that was slipping away from him. The chronicles record his final words, as a lament so pure and so quietly devastating that they gave my prefecture its very name. Even in dying, this man was leaving marks on the landscape of Japan that would last forever. His father, Emperor Keiko, the man who had feared him, redirected him, sent him away again and again, received the news of his son's death, and was, according to the chronicles, deeply grieved. There's a painful irony in that detail, that the ancient storytellers seem to have placed there deliberately. The emperor who could never bring himself to keep his remarkable son close, who responded to every triumph with another dangerous mission rather than with the warmth the son needed. That same emperor was shattered by the loss. It's the oldest regret in the human story. The recognition, arriving too late, of what was right in front of you all along and what it meant to lose it. Keiko ordered an imperial mausoleum built on the site of his son's death. It was the least he could do, and both of them knew it. The possessions of the dead prince were gathered together, including Kusanagi, the sacred sword he had left behind at Miyazuheim's home. His widow venerated his memory in a shrine, and eventually those relics, including the sword, were moved to what is now Atsuta Shrine in Nagoya, where they remain objects of deep reverence to this day. Yamato Takeru died at 30 years old. 30 years that contained more living, more fighting, more grief, more love, and more transformation than most people accumulate in a lifetime 3 times as long. And yet, as the mausoleum was sealed and the mourning began, the legend wasn't finished, because something happened after his burial that nobody could have predicted, something that lifted the story out of tragedy entirely and into something far more extraordinary. Every great story needs an ending worthy of everything that came before it. Not a tidy resolution that wraps things up too neatly, and not a fade to black that leaves you feeling empty, but something that captures the full emotional weight of the journey and transforms it into something larger than the sum of its parts. The ending of Yamato Takeru's story does exactly that, and it does it in a way that is so visually stunning, so spiritually resonant, and so perfectly calibrated to everything the legend has been building toward, that it feels less like a conclusion and more like a revelation. Because Yamato Takeru didn't just die, he transformed. Here's what the chronicles record. After the prince was interred in his imperial mausoleum in Ise, something extraordinary happened. A great white bird emerged from the tomb, soaring upward, rising into the sky, moving with the kind of effortless freedom that the prince himself had never quite been able to find in his short, relentless, battle-scarred life. When those who had gathered to mourn opened the coffin to investigate, they found nothing inside but empty clothing. The body was gone. Yamato Takeru hadn't simply died and been buried. He had shed his human form like a chrysalis and taken flight, literally, physically, miraculously, leaving behind only the garments that had contained him. The warrior who had spent his entire life being sent away had finally, on his own terms, departed. The white bird was seen to land in 2 more locations after leaving the mausoleum, and in each place a tomb was erected in its honor, as though the people who witnessed it understood instinctively that they were in the presence of something sacred and needed to mark the moment permanently. Eventually, the bird soared upward one final time and disappeared into the heavens. In Shinto tradition, this transformation wasn't metaphorical. It was understood as a literal spiritual event, the soul of the great prince releasing itself from the constraints of human existence and ascending to a divine state. In death, Yamato Takeru became what he had perhaps always been moving toward, not just a hero, but a kami, a divine spirit, worthy of worship and veneration, and worship him they did. Otori shrines dedicated to Yamato Takeru, where he is venerated as Otori-sama, the great bird, exist throughout Japan to this day. Every November, on a day of the rooster in the traditional calendar, festivals known as Tori no Ichi are held at these shrines, drawing enormous crowds who come to pray for prosperity and purchase kumade, decorative rakes adorned with lucky charms. Hanazono Shrine in Tokyo and Otori Shrine in Asakusa are among the most famous, hosting celebrations so large they sometimes span multiple days. A prince who lived and died nearly 2,000 years ago is still drawing crowds, still inspiring prayers, still shaping the rhythm of modern Japanese life. That's not legacy. That's immortality. What the white bird transformation does, on a deeper level, is complete the emotional arc of the entire legend in the most satisfying way imaginable. Here was a man who spent his whole life being pushed away, by his father, by circumstance, by the relentless demands of a world that used his extraordinary gifts without ever truly honoring the person behind them. In life, he was never free to simply be, but in death, in the form of a great white bird rising effortlessly into an open sky, he became the one thing he had always deserved to be: unbounded, uncontained, and impossible to send away. And here's one final thing worth sitting with, something that connects this 2,000-year-old story to one of the most iconic warrior traditions in all of human history. Most people don't know that Japanese folklore credits Yamato Takeru as the spiritual origin of the ninja. Not the literal first ninja. That tradition wouldn't be formalized for another 14 centuries. But the first person in Japanese mythological history to prove that the rules of combat are optional. That disguise beats armor. That patience beats aggression. That the most dangerous weapon isn't the one in your hand. It's the one nobody knows you're carrying. He didn't found ninjutsu. He founded the idea that made ninjutsu inevitable. And that idea has been living in Japan's oldest chronicles for 2,000 years, waiting to be recognized for what it always was. Not just a legend, a blueprint. That's the end of this video. Would you like to see more of it? I hope so. Let me know in the comments.